Hello and welcome back. Today is a very exciting day for me because I have just received this. This is the Phrozen Sonic Mini 4K. It's a resin printer. The way a resin printer works is that there's a screen at the bottom of the printer, and this projects ultraviolet light up into the resin as the z-axis raises. Layer by layer, it exposes an image which eventually becomes your print. Traditionally, most of the screens are about the same size as an iPhone, and this is no different. What does make it an exception is the fact that that screen is 4K. It's not the first resin printer with a 4K screen, however, all of those other printers have much larger print areas and the actual pixel density is much lower. Basically, on those larger 4K printers, you get about the same resolution in the X and the Y axis as you got before on the older, lower resolution small screens. What does this all mean for your print? Well, a higher resolution means crisper details. It's the same as a TV or a monitor or a phone. More pixels, sharper image equals more details. Now, I bought this printer with my own money. It is not sponsored by Phrozen in any way. I bought it as part of the pre-sale back in September. It is now December, almost the middle of December. Wow. Starting with that unbiased opinion, this thing took forever to arrive. This is not necessarily Phrozen's fault and doesn't affect the printer really, but it is something to bear in mind. If you do order this, it may take a very long time for it to arrive, which in all fairness is not uncommon with 3D printers. Are we rolling? Is this thing on? Hi, this is Edito from the future and I have just received this. This is a customs bill for basically a fifth of the price of what I paid for the printer. Now I am in Europe, so maybe it's slightly different depending on where you are, but this is very unexpected and it's strange that they sent it to me after I received the printer. I have not had this experience before, and if this is going to be something which is normal when you buy this particular printer, that's going to change the dynamic of this a little bit, because suddenly it's not a $300 printer, it's a $300 plus $50 plus $75. It's a $425 printer, and the only reason to buy it over any other printer is because of the 4K resolution. Now back to the video. Now that we got the theory out of the way, let's open the box.
What's in the box?
Be gentle. I've never actually done an unboxing video. I have no idea if I'm doing this right. I don't even know if there is a right way to do it. You're just taking it out of the box. Ooh! Oh. What is this? Oh, okay. So they give me lots and lots and lots of stuff. Oh, there's instructions. No. A little scraper. That's nice. I like that that doesn't have like a big laptop brick. This is very convenient. Oh, they give some gloves. Okay. Jesus, this is like lethal. This is the build plate. They've packed this. Oh. Wow, blinded by the light. Jeez, again. See, you see that? See that? Whoa, look at how bright that is. Look at that. Woo, hoo, hoo, hoo. Oh, I did it again. That's very smooth. Oh. It's surprisingly tiny. That's it. That is the empty box. There's nothing else. So, is this the thing that people like? Ready? Are you ready? I don't think I did that right. Oh, a sanding disc. I can finally renovate my house. Some loose screws. A wrench. Wow, this is actually a SanDisk. An 8 gigabyte SanDisk USB stick. That is fancy stuff. Oh, mirror, mirror on the wall. I feel like everything is really super reflective in this package. Oh, that's nice. Ooh, that's less nice. Is that tape peeling up?
Hello?
It is metal. There was something at some point where they were sending something with plastic vats and they were cracking. This is the printer. Plug it in now. Dear Frozen user, glad you've joined us. For the best experience, please read through the Frozen manual and follow step by step before you start. Yes, Frozen, I will read that. There's a lot of stuff. Power, which goes, yeah. It's making a sound. It beeped. Okay, 4K, congratulations. And then it turns into Chinese. So, the only thing left to do now is to start printing some things and doing a comparison of the print quality, because that's all we care about with print quality. Why else would you get 4K? I'm going to be comparing this to my old printer, which is substantially heavier. The Anycubic Photon. The Anycubic Photon really helped kick off the first wave of hobby-level resin 3D printers. And once I got the print settings dialed in, I found I could get pretty decent print quality very consistently. I mean, I've never printed anything with this and said, oh, if only it had more resolution. So because of that, I'm going to be doing a direct head-to-head comparison and just see if the 4K is really all that. And then magical transition. No? Okay, I have been printing pretty much non-stop for about a week, as I think you can sort of tell by this pile of stuff in front of me. And I've learned a few things. Unfortunately, it's not all good news.
Good news, everyone!
But let's start with the one thing that everybody's curious about, and that is, does 4K actually make a difference? And to me, the answer is yes. Yes, it does. It really does. However, I find that the biggest improvement is for small, highly detailed things. So for example, if you print at a 28mm scale, or something like this benefits hugely from the 4K resolution. The details are much crisper if you compare them to the Photon, for example. And I found myself discovering details in the model that I didn't know were there before. If you then want to go and paint, this makes it much easier to paint because you can see the details, and I find myself really excited about the smaller models now in a way that I really wasn't before. Unfortunately, I did find there is a point of diminishing return, whereas the small objects really benefit from 4K. The larger ones just don't as much because the details are larger, so you can actually fit the larger pixels into those and still get the same detail. There are some places where there is just a little bit more texture, but honestly that's something which nobody's really going to notice. I've found two other benefits to the 4K. The first is that the models feel more solid. They feel more like they're actually injection molded as opposed to printed. This isn't really something you can objectively say is a positive or a negative, but I do enjoy just how they feel, which is a weird way of describing it. The other benefit, which I did not expect, is that supports are easier to remove. This actually makes a lot of sense if you stop and think about it, because that connection point is highly detailed, and if you can actually resolve that detail, then that breaking point is going to be more accurate and easier to break. As far as print settings and print times, this is a monochrome screen, which is the newer generation of screens. Essentially, what that means is more light is supposed to get through, meaning you can print faster. The specifications I have been seeing have been anywhere between 2 and 3 seconds for this, and I've been a little conservative on my print settings, which we'll get into why in a minute. But I have found that to be pretty consistent. I've usually been printing at about 3 seconds, and the equivalent has been 7 or 8 seconds on my Photon. One other thing I noticed is that the factory set or recommended lifting speed, the speed at which the z-axis raises from the vat each time for each layer, that is set surprisingly high, and I ended up reducing it by half, which again might be slightly conservative, but I find it to be consistent. One other thing that I found myself doing is printing at a smaller layer height, so 0.03 millimeters as opposed to 0.04 or 0.05 millimeters on my Photon. Obviously, this adds to resolution gains, but it does slow down your print time. After playing with settings a little bit, I ended up basically having the same print time for the same model on both the Photon and the Sonic Mini 4K. The only difference being the Sonic Mini 4K came out more detailed. That's basically just the general overview on what you can expect from the actual prints. However, to get to this point was a little bit maddening. For all of these test prints, I used pre-supported minis that I actually subscribed to. They have a community of thousands of people testing, printing, and giving feedback. I did not want my skill, or lack thereof, in creating supports to be a variable. Right from the beginning, I had some fails, which is kind of the way it goes when you're setting up a new printer. You really should run calibration tests, but I don't think most people do that. So I just printed the test print, which was on the USB stick, which is the Phrozen Sonic ring. And this was interesting. It printed and it shows off the detail that it's capable of. However, it was one print in the middle of the build plate, which never happens, and the supports, well, they're never coming off. Basically, to get this thing to fail would be very difficult. But it made me feel confident with the resin settings. I just broke it! Because it worked and looked good, it made me feel confident with my resin settings, so I dove in face first with a whole plate filled with minis. You saw that first plate of models printed against the Photon, and while the Photon printed flawlessly, you cannot say the same about the Sonic Mini 4K. The resolution, the detail is absolutely there, but there were weird fails in weird places that I didn't feel had anything to do with support settings. And in situations like these, the typical Facebook forum response is level your build plate. And the answer is, well, okay, fine, let me re-level my build plate. And so, even though I'm fairly confident I know how to level a build plate, I gave it the benefit of the doubt and I re-leveled my build plate with no improvement. A big complaint people have seemed to have about this is that the bracket connecting to the build plate is too tight. This makes it difficult to loosen the build plate and ultimately actually get a proper level. And I did find it tight, but I didn't find it as screen-shatteringly tight as everybody was making it seem it would be. I did try to bend open the bracket a little bit to open it and sanded some of the areas where it connects. There was ultimately a little bit of an improvement, but this did not seem to be the problem. That was mostly just to tick that box. I also sanded the build plate with the included sanding disc. The fact that they send it with the printer means basically you're supposed to. I find this a terrible idea. Not only do you risk throwing off the evenness of the build plate, but with a heavy grit sandpaper like that, you're going to leave scratches that could potentially tear your FEP sheet. I made sure that after using the coarse sandpaper they sent me, I went over it with something much finer to get rid of any of those ridges and edges that could be sharp. It is possible to do this well and not have it affect your level, but it is difficult to do and it seems like an unnecessary risk, especially for something that when all of it is calculated together costs more than $400. I leveled again, and the result of that? An even worse fail! Like, way worse! At this point, I knew it couldn't be me. There must be something wrong with the printer. And this is when I found what I would call the first design flaw. Specifically, the way that the LCD screen is attached to the printer. The bottom of a resin vat is flat, as it should be, and that means that the surface that it's resting on should also be flat. In the case of the 4K, the screen is not flush with the top of the printer. There's almost 1/4 of a millimeter height difference, which doesn't sound like much, but when you're dealing with 0.05 to 0.01 millimeter layer heights, that is a huge difference. That is anywhere between 4 and 20 times the height difference. This is not good, but it's also not the end of the world. What really does it for me is the tape gasket that they put around the screen. In theory, this is a fantastic idea. We like this, because if there's ever a leak in the resin vat, it keeps the resin from dripping into your machine, into the electronics, and destroying it. I wish that the Photon had this. It's just that the tape they used is the thickest tape I have ever seen in my life. This thickness combined with the height of the LCD screen actually creates a comparatively monstrous air gap between the LCD and the bottom of the resin vat. That means it's essentially impossible to level this thing properly. And if you are magically able to level it, you're still shooting yourself in the foot because there's still this air gap, and what happens to light over distance? It expands and diffuses, so you will get less pixel accuracy and detail, which is the whole reason you bought a 4K printer in the first place. My solution was to take this monstrosity off, and after checking the height difference with some paper, I leveled off the edges around the screen with several layers of tape. I then resealed the edges with some scotch tape or cello tape. At this point it was really as flat as I could make it, and it already felt like a huge difference. And hallelujah, it worked! Mostly. There were still some very tiny fails in some strange places, and ultimately ended up with this guy being ripped in half. It ripped at a point with a very large surface area, and he probably should have been hollowed, but this was kind of the key for me. Because of the thickness of the tape from before, the FEP film was actually too loose, so without that I had to tighten it further. Interestingly, they didn't ship a wrench which fits those screws, which are 2.5mm hex bolts, so you will have to provide your own. Everything now works, and the quality is fantastic. But the journey is not over yet, and this brings us to our second design flaw, which unfortunately is much more difficult to fix, and I view it as a bigger problem. Resin printing is a battle between two opposing forces and the suction between them. The resin vat has to lose that battle, and the FEP is flexible for that reason, just as the build plate is solid for that reason. The vertical axis, as well as the arm attached to that build plate, also need to be rigid and inflexible. The plastic film, the FEP, at the bottom of the resin vat is the only thing that should flex. The arm connected to the axis, this here, is a joke. The Anycubic photon is by no means a perfect machine, but look at the difference between this chunky boy and that anemic thing. The fact that this can flex dramatically increases the force of the suction, and I have some serious doubts that the motors on this machine are going to be able to last for a very long time against this. One of the most common sounds you hear from a resin printer is a popping sound. This popping sound is as the FEP releases from your print, it snaps back down to the LCD screen, creating a popping sound. That sound is disturbingly loud on this machine. The arm and the build plate visibly flex as the Z-axis raises, and you can actually see it pop back into position as the FEP releases. I still think that the FEP is too loose, but I'm afraid to tighten it further because I don't know at what point the arm cannot handle the force. There is definitely space and a way to add a brace to this, but that is a much more involved adjustment. Quick side note, something that a lot of people have started using is what is called an NFEP. This is essentially an even more non-stick FEP. This is great and actually something you should probably use. However, there's no reason that the printer shouldn't work with the original FEP. Just using an NFEP is the equivalent to putting a band-aid on a problem. You should fix the problem first. To close off the complaints on a minor note, there is a huge amount of UV light leak from this thing. If I turn off the lights, you can see that it's, well, turns it into a disco, but you can even see the light leak with the lights on. I've actually started using this light to cure parts on cloudy days. I'm not entirely sure that this has any negative effects, but I don't particularly like the idea of UV light leaking all over. The printer itself is actually surprisingly loud. The fan is loud, but it's not any louder than any other printer I've used. However, the motor is surprisingly whiny. Because of the light leak and the sound, this is not necessarily a printer to have on your desk, although I haven't found that it smells particularly bad for a resin printer when you have the top on. That said, I'm not terribly bothered by the smell of resin, so I'm probably not the best one to judge this. On a final note, people like to complain about this plastic top. It's cheap, it gets messy. I actually quite like it because it gives you full access to everything, which in this case and the adjustments that it needs is very helpful. In the end, it all comes down to this. How much is this boost in resolution worth to you? For me, having seen and felt this difference, I will have a very hard time going back to the lower resolution screens for the smaller miniatures. For larger models, there is a point of diminishing return, and unless you do a side-by-side comparison, there's really no immediately discernible difference. But it does have some serious design flaws. There are workarounds, but it's a bit of a shame for a printer that, in the end, is no longer really that cheap. I hope you found this video and review helpful. I'm going to be making some more videos on resin printing in the future, so if you have not already, please like, share, comment, and most of all, subscribe. It really helps out the channel and you won't miss those upcoming videos. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.